The night was heavy with the kind of silence that wraps itself around the walls and whispers secrets to the shadows. And when the knock came at his door, it wasn't forceful or urgent, but soft, like a heartbeat. Hesitant and unsure, he opened it. In his sweatpants and a loose shirt still groggy from sleep, and there she was, his auntie. Not by blood, but by the way families tie themselves together over dinners and shared memories. She stood in her cream shawl, her hair pinned back the way he remembered from his childhood visits to her clinic, and her eyes didn't meet his at first. She said she was checking in, just making sure he was okay after the surgery he'd had last week, and though her voice tried to remain clinical, her hands clutched the medical bag a little too tightly, and her gaze finally lifted to his chest, not his eyes, then darted away. He let her in and offered tea, but she declined and instead motioned to the couch, gesturing that he should sit so she could inspect the stitches, though he could feel the heat rising in his skin, not from pain but from something much deeper, something tangled in the way her fingers brushed his skin through the bandage, her touch not accidental. Not anymore. She asked how he was. Sleeping, if he had fevers, if the pain had shifted, and he nodded, but none of the words seemed to matter. Because their breaths had started to slow and sink, as if their bodies were speaking what their mouths refused to say. Her hand lingered just a second too long over his heart, and his chest rose beneath her palm, and she didn't move. The shawl slipped a little, revealing the soft slope of her shoulder, and he watched her. As if hypnotized, her eyes met his again, and this time they didn't turn away, and when she leaned in, he didn't stop her. His breath caught in his throat, and hers trembled against his skin as her lips found his, softly, slowly trembling, as if unsure they deserved this sand. Then the kiss deepened. A sigh escaped one of them, or maybe both, and her hand found his hair and his arms circled her waist, and the world narrowed to the moment where doctor and patient labels faded, where auntie and nephew dissolved, and only heat and hunger remained her body against his. Warm, alive, seeking, she whispered his name, not the one everyone called him, but the one she remembered from when he was small, and sat on her lap after scraped knees and lost marbles, and he whispered hers, not auntie, not doctor, but the name she never let anyone use anymore. And in that moment, names became spells that broke down every barrier they were never supposed to cross. Then couch creaked as they sank into it, her hand pulling his shirt up, his fingers trembling at the buttons of her blouse. And every touch was both hesitant and desperate, a clash of what they knew and what they needed, and the night did not judge. Nor did the walls that had seen them grow in different ways, and when her lips left his, they trailed along his cheek, his neck, as if memorizing him again as a man, not as a boy, not as a patient, and she whispered that she shouldn't be here, that she should go, but her fingers clung to him. And his hand pressed to the small of her back, holding her still, asking her, without words, to stand. She did stay as her shawl slipped to the floor, and the room filled with warmth that had nothing to do with body temperature and everything to do with longing. That had waited far too long. The first rays of dawn touched the edge of the curtains and spilled across the floor like golden confessions, and she lay beside him, her hair loose, now her breath even, but not fully relaxed, because they both knew what daybreak meant. It meant questions. It meant reality. He turned to her, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, and she looked at him, not with regret, but with something far deeper, something that held both sadness and tenderness. Because last night had not been a mistake, it had been an unveiling. She spoke first, barely, a whisper saying this wasn't right, but her eyes said something else, that maybe for one night she had allowed herself to feel again, to be touched, not physically, but soul deep. And he nodded, not with agreement, but understanding, because he too knew this was a line they weren't meant to cross, but lines blur when hearts ache, when lives feel empty in their perfect routines. When someone looks at you, not like a title, but like a person, and he had looked at her like that, and she had melted into it. She sat up, wrapping herself in the shawl that had fallen forgotten, and her fingers trembled slightly as they ran through her hair, and he watched her silently, not sure if he should speak, not sure if saying something would ruin what they shared or save it. She said she had to return to her clinic soon, patients waiting charts to fill a life she had built carefully, and he almost laughed at the contrast between the order she lived in and the chaos they had created together, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he reached out and caught her hand, and she didn't pull away. He told her she could come back, not as a doctor, not as an auntie, but as herself, and her eyes glistened, and she nodded slowly just once before rising to her feet. He walked her to the door. The same door she had knocked on hours before, and she turned one last time, her lips brushing his again. Softer this time, not with hunger, but with a quiet promise, and then she was gone. The hallway echoing with her steps, but he knew it wasn't over. And she knew it too, because once a secret is born of truth and tenderness, it refuses to stay buried, and as the day began, he found himself touching his lips, remembering her, remembering what it felt like to be seen, not as a boy, not as a patient, but as a man who had been kissed by someone who shouldn't have stayed. But did and might. Again days passed, like slow-moving clouds, heavy with things unsaid and moments suspended, and every time his phone buzzed, he thought maybe it would be her. But it wasn't, and every time he passed the mirror, he saw her eyes in the way he looked at himself differently now, as if the kiss had marked him. Not just on his skin, but deep in the fabric of who he was. He replayed the way she had touched him. Not just his body, but his silence, the way she had leaned in, as if drawn by a force neither of them had the strength to resist, and now that force lingered in every room. He entered especially the one where she had undone the layers of distance. Between them he went to her clinic, pretending to need a checkup, though he knew his stitches had healed. Though his body felt fine, it was his heart that hadn't. And when he walked into the waiting room and saw her through the frosted glass moving, with the grace of someone trying to forget what she couldn't, he almost turned around, but she looked up and their eyes locked and in. That instant, the walls she had built around herself trembled again. She called his name in that same soft voice and asked him to come in, and he followed like someone returning to where he belonged, even if he shouldn't. Didn't ask why he came, and he didn't offer a reason instead. She motioned for him to sit, and her fingers touched his wrist to take his pulse, but they both knew it was racing for a reason that had nothing to do with his health. She whispered that he looked well, and he smiled and said only when he thought of her, and that made her hand falter, and her eyes lower, and then he reached up and touched her cheek and said her name softly, like a prayer, like a promise, like the beginning of something forbidden. Yet beautiful. She said they couldn't, and he nodded but didn't move his hand, and her breath caught again, and they both sat there suspended in a moment where choices lived and consequences waited and hearts beat louder than reason. He said she had made him feel more alive in one night than he had in years, and she confessed she had touched him that way because something inside her had been starving, and his presence had awakened it without her meaning to. He stood and took her hand and placed it on his chest where his heart beat like a drum and said, "If this is wrong, then let it be wrong, but let it be real." And she closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against his, and for a long time they stood like that, not kissing, not touching more, just holding something fragile between them. When he kissed her again, it was slower, deeper, threaded with everything they had held back in the days since their night together, and her arms slid around him and her body melted into his. And this time it wasn't surprise or desperation, it was surrender. She locked the door and led him to the room where she did her most personal work, not just on bodies but on hearts, and when she pulled him close again, she unbuttoned her blouse not with haste but with reverence, and he touched her not with hunger but with wonder, and she guided him not like a patient but like a partner. The bed in the back was small, but it didn't matter because their closeness left no room for space. And when they came together, it was slow, like the unfolding of a flower after a long winter, and her sighs filled the room with a sound that spoke of years of waiting and minutes of courage. She whispered that she had always been alone by choice, but now she didn't want to be alone by fear. And he told her he wasn't afraid, not of them, not of the world, not if it meant waking up to her skin and her voice and her heart. They lay there afterward, tangled in white sheets meant for sterilization, now soaked in something far more human. and her fingers traced his shoulder, and he told her about the dreams he'd had of her long before. She'd kissed him, and she laughed softly and said she'd thought. She was imagining his gaze all those years, and when he got up to leave hours later, she walked him to the same door again and kissed him in daylight, this time with the blinds half open and her white coat back on, but her lips still tasting of Yessie, told her he'd wait as long as it took for her to believe this could be real. And she said she didn't need time to believe, she just needed courage to claim it. Tanned as he walked away, he felt something in his chest expand, like breath, like light, like lovend. When she closed the door, her hand lingered on the handle as if holding on to him. Just a little longer, as if hoping he'd turn back, and he almost did, because her secret visit had ended long ago, but what they had begun had only just started.